Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Peter Credlin. Here's what's coming up on the program tonight. The rank hypocrisy of the left has been exposed yet again when it comes to the war in Gaza, as Labour politicians pick and choose which sorts of free speech they do and don't support. Pretty telling, that. Also, a big day in U.S. politics with moves underway to impeach Joe Biden. If only the White House had been less evasive with Joe Biden's son's Hunter's business dealings, this might not have happened. We'll find out what this means for 2024 a little bit later on in the show. Plus, are we seeing an escalation in the already precarious situation in the Gulf, with the Australian Navy being asked to assist in the Red Sea? Scary stuff happening there. Plus, a rare win for common sense, with a major psychiatric body departing from the push from gender ideology to push hormones and puberty blockers on young kids. You're not going to want to miss this big news. But first, the long, hot summer has begun. And guess what? In energy-rich Australia, it's about to become even hotter. Now, I'm coming to you from Sydney, where the mercury topped out in the high 30s today, which is, of course, normal for, summer in Australia. But not so much for the New South Wales government, which has asked residents in our prosperous and, again, energy-rich nation to cut back the power usage this evening until 9 p.m. State Energy Minister Penny Sharp made the plea today.
Every small bit of action that we take will make it much easier to make sure that the grid stays on and there's not a problem. No one's forced to do any of this. We're just simply saying, when you go home tonight, if you don't need to use your dryer or you don't need to put your dishwasher on until tomorrow morning, just please do that.
Gosh, look, far be it from me to suggest that people shouldn't do their part to keep the grid going, but you know what? No, actually, forget that. I am going to suggest exactly that. Because you know what, Penny Sharp? You know what, Chris Bowen? We live in a country with world-beating reserves of coal, natural gas, lots of that gas being very close to the surface, oil, yes, I said oil, as well as wind and sun, and oh yeah, what's that other stuff we're not supposed to talk about? Uranium. And the government, with all of this stuff, is telling us that because it's a bit of a hot one out there at the start of summer, we shouldn't run our dishwashers. We should turn off the pool pumps and turn the aircon up to 26 degrees. Which, by the way, that's not air conditioning, that's heating. Pull the absolute other one. Australia is an energy-rich country, and we should have some of the cheapest energy in the world and all be better off for it. And yet, we don't. Why? Well, there's a few points to make on this, and they don't all confine themselves to New South Wales, where the previous coalition government, with its Environment Minister Matt Keane, shut down the Liddell coal plant and was in the chair when the operators of the country's biggest coal-fired plant at Araring announced that it would shut down early in 2025. All the while encouraging operators to stop upkeep on their coal plants, which the government obviously wanted them to shut down in favor of renewables. Well done to all involved. Of course, as the state and the country has moved on to renewables, well, things have predictably become more expensive and less reliable. Despite the near-religious incantations of the likes of Chris Bowen and his high priest Albo to the contrary, if New South Wales is short of power, it affects the rest of the country too. I mean, New South Wales has to buy energy from Queensland, and it is also not able to sell power to Victoria, which has also put more stress on its grid by banning new gas connection and is going to force people, when they upgrade, to go electric. In a statement today, John Seeley, managing director of Seeley International, said, quote, "The Victorian government's reckless intent to push Victorians off gas will put significant stress on the state's fragile energy grid. force emissions higher, and compound the crippling cost of living crisis that is hurting households and small businesses across the state. Seeley went on to say, in words that I think apply not just to Victoria, but the entire nation, that, quote, consumers are clearly bearing the burden of this abject failure, unfairly punished by a government which is scrambling to play catch-up to meet their ambitious emissions targets. This is not the considered actions of a sensible government sincerely pursuing solutions to a climate conundrum. It is the rash, he said, and ideological pursuit of a tired government attempting to hoodwink the public with the perception of action without the outcome, unquote. And where's Energy Minister Chris Bowen in all of this? Well, he's swatting back from COP28, where he extravagantly spurned the entreaties of nearly 30 other nations who committed to tripling nuclear power to hit their climate targets, and instead cheered on declarations about the end of fossil fuels, which, in Australia, keep the lights on and our nation prosperous. Now on to the curious case of Usman Khawaja and his support for Palestine, which he was hoping to show at the first test against Pakistan by writing the words, "All lives are equal," on his shoes. Note, he didn't want to say all lives matter, because that, as we know, is incredibly racist. Instead, he is in strife for wanting to say all lives are equal, which again is a bit more controversial than it might sound on first reading if you are not across all the ins and outs of linguistic wokery. Now, we touched on this briefly last night, but there have been more developments in this situation that I think we need to dive a bit deeper into. This morning, Treasurer Jim Chalmers weighed in on the dispute, saying, quote, "I don't think it's an especially controversial statement." Dr. Chalmers said this Thursday morning, continuing saying, "The lives on one side of a conflict are not worth any more or any less than the lives on the other side of a conflict. And insofar as it goes, and we're talking about innocent civilians, sure. Though one might also say that an IDF soldier defending civilians is a lot more worthy than a Hamas terrorist raping and murdering them. But I digress, because here's the point I want to make. If Usman Khawaja truly believed what he wanted to write on his shoe, well, why didn't he do this earlier? Australia's World Cup cricket campaign kicked off not 24 hours after Hamas launched its bloody terror attacks with a match against India in Chennai on October 8th. It has been more than 60 days since. Did Khawaja ever wish to write a message of support, even one as anodyne as the one he has proposed, on behalf of the Israeli men, women, and children butchered by Hamas? Well, I'll tell you what, that would have been, frankly, a lot more stunning and brave, as the saying goes, than planting his flag for Palestine during a match against Pakistan. This is about, frankly, as courageous as those celebrities who are applauded for their courage when they say, give a rousing speech in favor of abortion at the Oscars. Yeah, stunning and brave indeed. What is also fascinating to me is how much support Khawaja is getting from the left side of politics. The same side of politics that a few years back saw Israel Folau attacked for posting on his own time about why he, as a Christian, was against gay marriage. The difference shows, I think, just how far the mindset that is, I think, frankly Marxist has crept into our society, and how the attitude that goes along with it, that excuses complete and total changes in direction and principle on what should be fundamental issues such as, do you respect free speech or not? And lets that change depending on whether that free speech is needed to serve the cause of the revolution and liberation or not. Now let's break this down. Folau, though of Tongan ancestry, is a devout Christian. Therefore, in that Marxist woke mindset, he's an oppressor. And in a conflict between him and gay people, well, he loses. And so did his free speech rights. The Wallabies, of course, were just collateral damage and all that. Meanwhile, Khawaja, a Pakistani-born Australian, has taken the side of the Palestinians, a double play of victimhood. While on the other side of that equation, well, the left has accepted the narrative that Israel is illegitimate, a colonial settler state, and whatever Hamas did, hey, that's what resistance looks like. And to paraphrase what has been in the past attributed to Vladimir Lenin, you can't make an omelet without butchering babies and brutalizing women. So, unlike Falau's speech, Khawaja, well, what he's doing, he's advancing the cause of the revolutionary left. So his free speech, that's worthy of support and defense. And anyone who tries to shut him down is in the wrong. Well, I say ideally, of course, politics wouldn't invade sport. And I wouldn't take a cricketer's advice on how to vote or feel about the Middle East any more than I'd trust an accountant to tell me whether Australia should bowl first if it wins the toss. Perhaps the rule then should be that everyone should play as a team and keep politics well off the field, but be free to post to their heart's content as individuals. Meanwhile, Khawaja has wound up instead wearing a black armband which is allowed to show his quote-unquote solidarity with the Palestinians. But if all lives were equal, maybe he'd have something to say about the innocents killed by Hamas too. Or would that be just a little bit too stunning and brave for his liking? Right, let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. The federal government has hosed down expectations it will deliver on a US request for naval assistance in the Middle East, where Iran-backed rebels continue to threaten and attack commercial ships. Announcing more Australian troops are headed to Europe to train Ukrainian forces, the acting Prime Minister confirmed the US is requesting an Australian warship to patrol waters in the Red Sea.
We'll consider that request in the normal way. I want to emphasise the focus of our efforts is on our immediate region.
The United States is trying to build support from international partners to deploy ships to protect the critical trade route turned conflict zone after attacks from Yemen-based Houthi rebels.
This is an international problem that requires an international solution.
The rebel group has vowed to block ships heading to Israel until the offensive in Gaza has ended, but the Australian government is more concerned about its own shipping lanes. The government has faced more criticism for backing a UN resolution for a ceasefire in the conflict. The coalition claims the government is more concerned with winning votes in places like Western Sydney, including the PM's own electorate, instead of supporting Israel or saving civilians.
Yeah, but he wants to talk out of one side of his mouth to one audience, and then he wants to talk out of the other side of his mouth, appeasing to the Penny Wong left side of the Labor Party, and protect his own seat of Grayndler, where we know they're moving more and more to the extreme left.
From the very beginning, the government has said that Israel absolutely has a right to defend itself, but it has to do that in accordance with international humanitarian law.
One Labor MP who's currently in Israel thinks a ceasefire isn't the right approach.
What I do support is that there be humanitarian pauses. That last time there was a humanitarian pause, it resulted in many Israeli hostages being released.
Unemployment has jumped to its highest level in 18 months, hitting 3.9% as interest rate rises finally hit home. A bumper month of jobs growth in November was more than offset by a growing labour force. The Treasury forecasts that the unemployment rate will hit 4.5% next financial year.
And these numbers give us some hope that the employers and the workers of this country are hanging in.
All right, as always, there's plenty to get through, so joining me tonight now is Sky News senior reporter Caroline Marcus and senior writer and columnist at the Herald Sun, Patrick Carline. Caroline, Patrick, welcome to the program. Now, big news today in the ongoing Kathleen Folbigg case, with the woman once branded Australia's worst female serial killer having her conviction quashed. This has been a really long run from being found guilty of causing the deaths of her 4 children in the early 2000s up to now. Caroline, what can you tell us about this case, and are there still any lingering doubts?
Well, there are still lingering doubts for Kathleen Folbigg's ex-husband, Craig. He said back in June when she was released from prison and pardoned that he still believed that his children, their children, had been murdered. This is not necessarily a happy day for everyone, but for Kathleen Folbigg, it is certainly a major victory, 20 years in the making. She's always maintained her innocence, and today a Court of Criminal Appeal threw out her convictions over the deaths of her 4 children. Now, that whole case hung on mainly her private diaries, in which the prosecution at the time alleged that she had admitted guilt. Other experts have since weighed in to say, well, that could just be the kind of self-blame that you might expect to see of a bereaved parent. And of course, scientific evidence emerged since then, which put forward reasonable doubts whether the children had actually died from a genetic mutation or natural causes. Genetic mutations were found in 2 of the children and Kathleen Folbigg herself. So ultimately, her convictions are quashed. But James, what is to come is she has already indicated she is going to sue for some kind of wrongful imprisonment or some kind of malicious prosecution, perhaps. So it could be a big settlement.
Fascinating. Well, we haven't heard the last of this one yet, I'm sure, Caroline. Now, there's been a massive blow, Patrick, to the suite of anti-protest laws in New South Wales. The Supreme Court here has struck down aspects of the law that were used to basically prosecute people who had been blocking ports and other sorts of infrastructure for environmental and other reasons. Under the judgment, the government can't criminalize these activities. Make of that what you will. Patrick, down in Melbourne, you've had plenty of these sorts of problems as well with Extinction Rebellion. What's your reaction to this? Are the courts finding the right balance here between free speech and letting people get on with their lives?
Well, James, I think you make the point. These protests are about maximum disruption. They're basically about trying to get in the way of everybody else as much as they can. And there's an arrogance to that I think ordinary people are just tired of. The idea that their message is so important that they literally must stop traffic and bring everything to a standstill is absurd and offensive, frankly. Down here, the Victorian police have started fining them. I think it's about $385 a pop. And it's really hoped. I mean, that's the way to go. Hopefully it will temper this sort of protest zeal, which doesn't represent mainstream views. These are very extreme views. And I think average people are very tired of it.
Absolutely, they are. Now, Caroline, you know what else people are being tired of is high energy bills and being told they can't use their energy, which has just happened in New South Wales, where the energy minister, as I said earlier, has gone and said, turn down your aircon, don't use the dryer, turn off your dishwasher. We're an energy-rich nation, Caroline. This is surely not excusable.
Well, Penny Sharp, the energy minister here, she wants us to put our air conditioning on to between 24 and 26 degrees here in New South Wales this evening between 5 and 9 o'clock. Now, that to me is heating. Am I wrong?
Correct.
That is more like heating. I'm not going to sit there and swelter when today in Sydney we've faced temperatures of up to 38 degrees. And personally, I know that the energy market operator might be warning this is going to put too much demand on our grid. I would prefer that our leaders tackle the question of having more supply in the grid, perhaps not shutting down coal power stations like Liddell earlier this year.
And maybe build a nuclear plant, hey? I don't know. Crazy talk. And now, finally, Patrick, I just want to ask you here, big political fight gearing up here between state Labor premiers in New South Wales and Victoria and the federal government over infrastructure funding. Now, does Jim Chalmers here have a point about this, or is this going to be a new Donnybrook that Albanese and Chalmers are going to have to sort out?
Well, I think, I suspect that Tim Pallas actually has a point on the numbers if you look at them literally. What I also suspect is he's not going to get a lot of sympathy given that he's presided over record debts for Victoria, which we will be paying for decades. You look at the suburban rail loop, which hasn't even begun yet. That's $35 billion. No one really understands why it's going to be built and how it's going to help. It's a dirty word to a lot of Victorians already, and the Victorian government wants federal funding for that. I think most people will be saying, please don't fund this because it's a dud.
Well, can't say fairer than that. Patrick, now thank you so much for your time. Patrick Caroline Marcus, really appreciate it. Now, it's been a bad day for Joe Biden with the U.S. Congress voting to keep going with their impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden. Republicans claim that this will help them get them around the White House stonewalling about the president's troubled, to say the least, son Hunter Biden and his business dealings, many of which come back to the White House. Hunter has defied, meanwhile, a Republican subpoena to give closed-door testimony over his dubious business dealings, and he'd rather do it on his terms. Have a look at this.
I'm here today to make sure that the House committee's illegitimate investigations of my family do not proceed on distortions, manipulated evidence, and lies.
Joe Biden was also evasive, refusing to take questions, isn't that a nice change, on this subject at a briefing.
Ask the press to step out so we can begin our briefing. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, in fairness to the president, it's hard to tell these days what is obfuscation, what is just a genuine brain fade. Joining me now to discuss this is Sky News contributor Kosha Gata. Kosha, welcome to the program. Let's start with the impeachment inquiry vote. Democrats are saying that this is just, a big Republican smear campaign. I reckon there's a fair bit more when you look at some of these money transfers. What do you think, and what do you think the politics of this looks like for 2024?
Great to be with you, James. There is quite a bit more here. That's not to say that politics isn't one driving factor in this, because whether we like it or not, that's the world we live in right now, and politics and the justice system and Congress and everything else is at a stark intersection, and there's no denying that. But there is legitimacy to it, because basically, if I were to boil it down, what it comes down to is there some proof of impropriety or corruption being that has taken place both when Biden was vice president as well as right now while he's a sitting president, and the other side is saying, well, there isn't direct proof. There aren't direct transfers of money from Hunter Biden's bank account into Joe Biden's bank account. Unless you have that, you can't bring these charges. But actually, there is a criminal statute over in the U.S. Code saying that you don't need to show a direct transfer of money. You just have to show that there was influence. This is the quid pro quo clause, that there's got to be influence there, and there's a quid pro quo benefit that was received by actors that otherwise would not have received it. And there's ample evidence of that. There's 2 or 3 examples for those paying attention that really pop. And, that's what this is about. Opening and formalizing this inquiry gives them subpoena power. As you mentioned, the first witness they wanted to subpoena was Hunter Biden, and that did not go the way, I guess, traditionally one would have expected it to.
Yeah, and when you talk about the money trail and so on, we know that Joe Biden, when he was Obama's vice president, met with a large number of Hunter's clients who presumably, that's what they were trying to buy was the access. And it seems to me that when you've got that, plus all of the suspicious transaction reports that have been filed around the Biden family bank accounts, anybody else, this would seem like an open and shut RICO case.
It would, and only a dummy would ever get on the phone and directly have video evidence saying transferring this money and show that. Nobody does that, and bribery has been around since the beginning of bribery. People always use a third party or shell companies or things like that. The 3, I think, most important examples that pop is the Burisma board, where infamously Hunter was getting $80,000 a month to sit on that board, and there is evidence that it actually affected U.S. public policy, and that the Biden, as vice president in his portfolio, defied what the standing policy of the U.S. government was in getting that prosecutor fired who was investigating Burisma. There's the other example of Yelena Baturina, the former First Lady of Moscow, who wired $3.5 million to Hunter Biden. And then later on, when Russia went forward and invaded Ukraine and the U.S. issued this whole list of sanctions against all sorts of Russian oligarchs, she was conveniently exempted from that. And then there's a third one where the Bank of China has received preferential treatment in terms of U.S. regulatory standards that every other company in the world must abide by if they want to list on the NASDAQ or the U.S. stock exchanges. And they have an exemption from that. And we know that there's money trails of Chinese private equity funds giving money into the Biden enterprises. So things like that, as it comes out in this probe and the American people get a broad understanding of that, they're not going to be in the weeds perhaps as much as you and I are. I don't think it's playing well, certainly with independents or people that aren't wedded to the Bidens.
Kosha Gata, we're going to have to leave it there, but this is not the end of this story. Thank you so much for your time. Now, after the break, more on the sheer hypocrisy of these so-called calls for peace in the Gaza war. Plus, Are we seeing a major escalation in the conflict with a request for Australia's assistance in the Red Sea? We'll find out after the break. Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Peter Credlin. Now, at the top of the show, I talked about the contradictions and downright hypocrisies of so many people on the left over the Gaza war. Now, people are entitled to a view, even entitled to take a stand on the situation, absolutely. But, you know, what we're missing here is just consistency. And what is even more galling is our political leaders, namely the Labour Party, shifting away from supporting our one democratic ally in the Middle East, Israel. The backing of the UN resolution for a ceasefire seems more like political pandering to their inner city and Western Sydney bases than a carefully calculated geostrategic response to one of the biggest challenges of our time. Joining me now to discuss all this is Alex Rivchin, the co-CEO at the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the program tonight. There's so much happening in the last few days to talk about. But this ceasefire call, tell me about how has the Jewish community here in Australia reacted to this sudden shift in position by the Albanese government?
Well, James, with great disappointment, and it's left us rather confused as to what the government's position on this actually is. Because on the one hand, Prime Minister Albanese signs a joint letter with his counterparts in Canada and New Zealand, which, among other things, calls for Hamas to be dismantled for their atrocities and abominations of October 7th, acknowledges that they can have no future part to play in Gaza. And on the other hand, at the same time, they vote in favour of this UN General Assembly resolution, vote against the United States and against Israel in favour of a ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire, which in fact prolongs the war, prolongs the conflict, and makes it more difficult for Israel to achieve and complete its military mission of destroying Hamas and freeing its hostages. So there's an incompatibility there in the government's position, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that the government felt compelled to issue a clarification of what its position was, which I guess compounded that confusion. So the position of the government at this time needs to be crystal clear, and if it wants this war to end, as we all do, it should be calling clearly and regularly and unequivocally for the surrender of Hamas, to lay down its arms so that it may face justice. That is how we'll end this war. That's how we'll end the civilian toll of this conflict.
And Alex, there's just going to be, you know, they may think they can appease the people on the far left and the green left and the pro-Palestinian movement, but they can't, because if you look at what happened to Richard Marles' office, he's just the latest to be a victim of vandalism. His office has been spray painted by pro-Palestinian people saying it's all Palestinian blood and all of that. Where do they sort of realize that actually, you can see it on your screen there, that actually there's no way to appease people who think like this?
I think that's a very good point. And we've seen over the years that these extremists, they can't be placated and they can't be satisfied. They have been trying for many years to push Labor to take a more hostile policy towards Israel over things like reversing the Morrison government's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which it very clearly is. They're pushing Labor to recognise a Palestinian state, and one now wonders what sort of a state would that have been? Would that have been a state with Hamas at its helm? So it's absolutely correct. A clear line needs to be taken because these people won't be appeased. But this is where principle and integrity has to trump narrow political motives and ambitions. And when Israelis are fighting for their lives, when their best and brightest are engaged in hellish urban warfare, in tunnels and booby-trapped alleys exposed to ambush and sniper fire and IEDs, dying by the day, fighting for the future of the Jewish people in the state of Israel, the least those soldiers can count on and the state of Israel should be able to depend on is the understanding and the support of its liberal democratic allies.
And Alex, just want to ask you very quickly about Usman Khawaja. It seems a bit interesting that he's waited all of this time to finally come out and say that all lives are equal. I don't remember him saying anything like that at the start of this conflict. Do you?
I do not. But look, Kawaja strikes me as a good fella. I think his motives are pure, but I question the premise of his protest that he's trying to do with the marking of his boots there, because he's explained it by saying that the Palestinians are voiceless and he wants to give them a voice. And I really question that. I mean, the Palestinians have benefited from weekly protests on our streets, from actors in theatres wearing their scarves, from petitions, from dedicated UN agencies focused on them alone, UN days of recognition of the Palestinian cause. They receive more aid per capita than any other people in the world. They receive the sort of attention that every other beleaguered and supposedly oppressed people and stateless people desperately crave. So this notion that he's giving a voice to the voiceless, I question that. But ultimately, if he wants to write All Lives Matter or whatever it is on his boots, and I thought All Lives Matter was a phrase that no one should ever utter apparently, he's entitled to do that. But really it's for his employees to determine whether the platform they give him and the salary, the handsome salary they pay him, is for his cover drive or for his political activism.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Alex Riffin, for your time, and I'm sure we'll be speaking again next year. Now, let's go on to what I honestly think is a pretty important piece of news happening out of the Middle East, where the U.S. Navy has asked Australia to send warships, a ship, to the Red Sea to help defend against Iranian-backed militias who have been threatening shipping in the region. Now, this comes after a series of attacks and raids by Houthi rebels on Israeli and U.S. vessels operating in the vital sea lane, and also aiming attacks at Israel. Joining me now is senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, thank you so much for your time. I want to get into the broader ramifications of this request, but before we do, tell us what this would mean to our Navy if we were to agree to this request. Would that shift our force posture in any sort of way?
Hi, not really. It wouldn't, in the sense that we have done this sort of thing before, where we've deployed a warship into the Arabian Sea in support of US and coalition operations. So this would essentially be the same thing. And we've already got personnel deployed in the Middle East in support of US and other allied operations there now. So I don't see this as being a massive disruption to Australian Defence Force capabilities or anything like that.
But what about, though, this conflict that's happening, bringing in the Houthi rebels in Yemen? It's been an obscure conflict in the region for a long time, but it's become quite important now to what's happening between Israel and Gaza. These guys are backed by Iran, and there's this escalation that's happening with attacks on shipping. Tell us a bit more about that conflict and what Iran's role is in dialing this up.
Well, essentially, Iran supports the Houthis. They also support radical Palestinian and Islamic groups across Iraq and Syria. And these groups, as well as the Houthis, have been engaged in attacks right across the region, including against US forces in Iraq and Syria, as well as against commercial shipping in the Red Sea. And so what the Houthis are about is essentially imposing a cost on commercial shipping, driving up tensions. I think Iran is playing very much a grey zone game here, where it's trying to attack the US and get them to back down and inflict cost, but doing so at a level below that which would require a direct military response. And they're doing these constant attacks. And what you're seeing is the US respond with pinprick responses to these attacks. But those pinprick responses aren't really deterring the attacks from happening in the future. So you now have a situation where the Houthis have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea. That's interfering with maritime trade. And so the US is now being forced to consider a more robust response in the form of some sort of multinational maritime task force.
And how much control does Iran actually have over these rebels? I mean, is there the chance that they could go off and create an incident on their own, possibly by accident, that would then wind up widening this conflagration out of just Israel and Gaza to something much more dangerous?
Look, I think Iran has pretty tight control over the likes of Hezbollah and also the groups on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Maybe less control over the Houthis. But, you know, the Houthis do rely on Iran heavily for funding and weapons. So ultimately, Iran is pulling the strings here. And what the US needs to do is to basically impose some degree of cost on Iran itself in order to deter further attacks. The risk, of course, is in doing so, you could then see regional escalation of the war beyond Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So it is a challenging situation for the US. They can't just simply ignore these attacks. They can't ignore attacks on international shipping, but they have to respond in a way that avoids that wider regional war.
Yeah, Dr. Malcolm Davis, thanks for your time. This is, I think, absolutely one to watch in the weeks ahead. Now, after the break, a big win for common sense with a major psychiatry body bucking the trend of endorsing gender-affirming care for children. More on that good news shortly. Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Peter Credlin. In a move that's sure to rile up the lefty gender ideologists, the region's peak psychiatry college has said it now does not endorse gender-affirming care, that's surgery and puberty blockers and all that stuff, as the key intervention for children who believe they may be transgender. It's a huge shift by the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, and here to talk about it is Dr. George Halas. George, thank you so much for telling us about this. What is the story here? What has happened? What has prompted this really remarkable change?
Thank you, James. I agree with you. It is really absolutely remarkable and almost unbelievable in some sense. The trigger for it has been coming a long time. And I was speaking with Peter Credlin about a month ago about overseas trends. And it is really this overseas trend that has been picked up in this latest Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists position statement, which focuses on the role of psychiatrists in care and working with transgender children and adolescents and adults. The main thrust of this paper, the position statement, is for some people common sense, but for other people it's a radical departure from the trend that has been pervasive for the last 10 to 15 years. What I speak of here as the major shake-up is that it defines sex as a biological characteristics that define the human being as being male or female. Now, for some people this may seem commonsensical, but if you've been following and immersed in the debates and seen some politicians being questioned in Senate hearings and elsewhere to define what is a man, what is a woman, and they really sort of struggle, like they really are lost for words, it is so refreshing to hear the college that I belong to just say that sex is a defining characteristics. They go on also to define gender and gender dysphoria and gender incongruence and all the technical things.
And yet, Doctor, this comes out of years and years of this being the opposite direction, and you would have had an awful lot of young people, and we saw the case of the Tavistock Clinic in Great Britain and all sorts of other issues around people who've decided to detransition around the world, in the US, here, the UK. There's been an awful lot of people who have suffered greatly because this common sense hasn't been the common practice. Isn't that right?
Now, James, you've touched on one of the major advances of this position statement. It is to actually acknowledge that there is such a thing as detransitioning, which means that those youngsters who thought they wanted to transition and go through social transition, medical transition with hormones, some with surgical transitions, which are really virtually irreversible, then they decide that they want to go back to their original state, which of course creates major havoc in their lives. And this population has been virtually disenfranchised in previous position statements and guidelines. The position statement from our college puts this smack square in the debate that you cannot have a gender debate without having the outcome of detransitioners acknowledged and the specialist care that they also will require, perhaps long-term, perhaps for life, as they come off their medication and try to revert back to their original biological state.
And, Doctor, doesn't this also bring into question some of the stuff that we see? I mean, you know, you see things like children's books that are aimed at 3- and 4-year-olds, aiming to try and tell them, hey, you might think you're a boy, but you're a girl, and all this sort of thing, in the same way that, you know, little kids might think that they're a dinosaur or something like this, and trying to medicalize, you know, what are sort of normal stages of growth for a lot of kids.
And that's one of the thrusts of the power of this position statement. It reinstates what's called developmental thinking. As you say, James, children go through normal phases of what's called magical thinking. And the previous ideology, or current even in many places, of the affirmation model does not distinguish a 3-year-old's magical thinking from genuine, some of them are genuinely transgender even at the age of 3. So I have to emphasize that.
Sure.
This is a very nuanced paper, and I acknowledge the nuances, and I don't want to be simplistic and override the years of work that goes into such research.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. George Halas, we're going to have to leave it there. It's absolutely fascinating. Dr. George Halas from Monash University, appreciate your telling us about this important development. Now, stick with us, because coming up, we're going to talk about why the government wants businesses to prove there's a tradie shortage. Did we not know this already? Plus, fears of another black summer as fire mitigation efforts fall short. After the break. Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, sitting in for Peter Credlin tonight. Joining me now is tonight's panel, former Liberal MP Nicole Flint and Shadow Environment Minister Jonathan Duniam. Gang, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us tonight. Want to get started with this first issue here about Claire O'Neill, the Home Affairs Minister. After failing to keep stateless detainees locked up, she wants the construction industry to prove there's a shortage of tradies before she'll actually let them bring in more skilled migrants. Now, blue-collar construction trades like bricklayers, general laborers, and plasterers are all ineligible for the fast-track visa scheme, while migrants earning over $135,000 can sail through in 7 days under the labor policy. Nicole, first to you. We have a skills shortage and a housing shortage, yet this seems to me like a total stitch-up where, to get their immigration program over the line, they had to get the CFMMEU on side and say, no, don't worry, guys. You're not going to face any overseas competition. Everybody else is fine.
So what we have here, as we know, is a housing crisis and shortage in Australia, and a skills shortage in construction, particularly bricklayers and plasterers, and we could solve both problems at the same time, which sounds like a no-brainer to me, by letting in the skilled tradies that we need, and yet Claire O'Neill is saying no. Now, to me, James, it seems like Minister Claire O'Neill might be another Chris Bowen that we have on our hands, whereby any policies that she touches go completely and horribly wrong. The government needs to revisit this immediately. The skills shortage in construction has been a problem from when I was last in Parliament, and Labor need to get on and just address this for the good of the nation and to solve this housing crisis.
And Jonathan Duniam, I mean, when you look at the way they've marketed this immigration program, they said, oh, no, we're cutting it, we're bringing it down. But then when you actually look at the numbers, it's still actually an increase over their previous predicted numbers over the next 5 years. So we're getting 1.6 more people competing for housing and infrastructure that we haven't built. Can we at all trust the numbers here that they've given us this time?
No, James, absolutely not. And what do they say? Politics is about reinforcing perceptions. Well, the perceptions around Labor and border controls and being tough on illegal immigrants and the like, and actually managing our immigration system, are pretty negative. So, of course, they are, true to form, doing exactly as you'd expect, and they are allowing bad things to happen with bad decisions, and no, we can't trust them. And the numbers they give us today will in no way bear out what we should expect to see over the next 18 months in the lead up to the next election. And I know Dan Tehan, James Patterson and Andrew Hasey are going to be hammering this government over their poor management of the borders and immigration, and I look forward to being a part of holding this government to account.
And Jonathan, I want to just stick with you for a second here because we've got more stories too coming out about fears that despite the rain that we're going to get in Queensland from Cyclone Jasper, there's fears that we're going to get another black summer bushfire season here in New South Wales because they haven't been doing their hazard reduction burns properly. Tell us about this here, and why are residents still not able to take the steps they need to protect their own properties?
Every summer, James, we have this conversation, and it normally relates to public lands, so land managed by state and territory governments, and the need to manage fuel load. Now, it's common sense. You want to reduce the severity of a bushfire in summer, and what you're going to do is you're going to reduce the fuel load. That normally happens through a fuel reduction burn. Now, no state or territory government does enough. And I believe there should be minimum mandatory levels to which these burns occur every year, but it just never happens. What's worse, though, is these private landholders, farmers, foresters and other land users who want to actually manage their land properly are being prevented from by laws, from actually managing their lands and reducing the fuel loads on the land they own and manage. This, of course, means the severity of the bushfires, because these farmers and foresters can't get permits to do these controlled burns, are going to be much larger. Now, the same people who are imposing these restrictions, this green tape on these land managers, are the same people who are mandating these reductions in carbon emissions across the country. Do they think about the fact that these bushfires, when they get to such a size and scale, are going to emit more carbon than our national economy does in any given year? They don't. It's ideological and it's bad policy, and it's got to stop.
Absolutely. Now, Nicole, I want to stay with you on the environmental front here because activists at Greenpeace are taking Woodside Energy to court, saying the company made misleading and deceptive claims about their efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Also, there's other suits going on here. The energy company Santos is fighting a similar case brought by the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. I've never heard of these people before. Nicole, where are these activist groups getting the money to take these big multinationals to court?
Well, that's a very important question, James, and especially with Woodside and Santos, who employ hundreds of thousands of Australians and provide much needed income for the nation and export dollars as well. Now, when you have a look at Greenpeace's website, for example, it says we get our money from a lot of donations from individuals, but they also state that they get some donations from private charitable foundations. Now, James, I don't know who these foundations are because they don't name them, but I'm pretty willing to guess that they have probably been set up by billionaires whose carbon footprint is probably bigger than the state of Tasmania, where my good friend Senator Johnny O'Donovan's from. These are the wealthy individuals who fly in and out of Davos and fly around the globe on their private jets and have enormous mansions, I would imagine. I don't know, James, I could be wrong. But Greenpeace and these sorts of groups need to come clean on who is really bankrolling what must be very expensive court action against companies who are just trying to earn income and keep the lights and the power on for Australians.
Well, Nicole, as we were talking about earlier in the program, here in New South Wales, whether or not we're allowed to keep the lights on this evening, that's going to be a close-run thing. But, Jono, I want to mention this one to you here because as we talked about last night, the COP28 summit has reached an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels rather than at least completely phase them out. More than 198 countries have approved the declaration after negotiations, but this government, our government, seems to love having its cake and eating it too. Just as Jim Chalmers praised the budget, which is a surplus thanks to the sale of fossil fuels, his environment minister is in Dubai with his green hat on. Can you square this circle for me, Jono?
Well, before I do, I want to let you in on a dirty little secret Labor don't want you to know, and that's in relation to Greenpeace. There's a group called the Environmental Defenders Office, which is actually funded by the Albanese Labor government to the tune of $10 million. And they're the ones bringing these actions in partnership with Greenpeace and other activist organisations. So I just thought I'd put that out there for your viewers. It's an important fact. But on COP, and there's nothing better to save the world than a gathering of 100,000 well-meaning people in one location and a communique signed by a bunch of well-meaning people at the end of it. I mean, I don't know what they hope to achieve, but frankly, what we do in this country, and I would expect the same for every other country around the world, they should do what's right for them. No one wants to harm the environment. We should do what we can to minimise our impact on it. But the one thing we should be doing is making sure that energy policy is dictated by our government in accordance with our needs. We need cheaper power. We need reliable power. We don't need to sign up to these communiques to feel good about ourselves. Although one good thing did come out of COP this year, and that is this push to speed up the deployment of nuclear as a means of getting to net zero quicker and, of course, getting more cheap, reliable energy into the market. That's a good thing.
That's good. John O'Donoghue, Nicole Flint, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me on the panel tonight. I'll see you tomorrow night on the U.S. Report at 8 p.m. And now, here's Steve Price filling in for Andrew Bolt.